David Walsh. I will introduce you in Spanish because
Yes,
I speak
yes,
better
yeah.
Spanish than English.
Yeah.
¿No? Profesor David Walsh es profesor de Filosofía Política en la Universidad de University of America. Él estudió en Dublín y hizo su doctorado decía que el profesor David Walsh es profesor de Ciencia Política en la Filosofía Política en la Universidad Católica de América, Catholic University of America. Él es irlandés, estudió en Dublín y luego hizo su doctorado en la Universidad de Virginia. De la obra del profesor Walsh, tengo aquí todas sus obras, pero no voy a citarlas. Yo destacaría 3 libros que constituyen una cierta unidad. After Ideology, el segundo libro se llama The Growth of the Liberal Soul, y el tercer libro, que es el último que ha publicado, se llama The Luminosity of Existence, The Modern Philosophical Revolution. Son 3 libros que intentan, y creo que consiguen, realizar una reinterpretación del pensamiento liberal de una manera, diría, no muy convencional, bastante original. Original en el sentido de ir a las fuentes, a los motivos que impulsan estos pensadores a repensar el mundo, el hombre, la sociedad, etc. Publicó además otro libro que es este, The Third Millennium, Reflections on Faith and Reason, donde el profesor Walsh desarrolla algunas ideas que parecen bastante interesantes sobre las relaciones en la historia y en el presente entre fe y razón. Yo le voy a dar la palabra a él. Thank you very much, Professor Walsh, for accepting our invitation to come here and to be with us.
All right, wonderful. Want me to use this?
No,
okay. All right, all right. Well, thank you very much, Rafa, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come here to the Center for Science, Reason and Faith. I'm very happy to be here. And it's great to have an opportunity to share some thoughts together and to just engage in conversation on matters on which we're mutually very interested. As Rafa mentioned, I will draw my talk from a chapter that I did in this book called The Third Millennium. And since he specifically asked me to do something on reason and faith, since I had a chapter on that, I figured, well, that would be good, and I could send a PDF, and you could also have a chance to look at it. So it'll be a somewhat less formal way of proceeding, and then you can, launch off into whatever conversation and questions are of interest to you. I wrote the book and that chapter 12 years ago, just before the turn of the millennium, and so it was one of those writings on the occasion, not necessarily part of any long-term projects, but those are Rafa mentioned the books that I've done on modernity, which has been a kind of more long-term issue for me. But naturally, reason and faith are reflections that you would have as part of that. So I thought that, we're living through an historic time in terms of the calendar, at any rate. The turn of the millennium was a peculiar moment in history where we were privileged to pass through it in the modern world. There won't be another turn for another 1,000 years, so it's an opportunity to write something about it and not let it simply go past in silence. Obviously, there were many things happening at that stage. Everybody was worried that their computers were going to crash. Well, that didn't turn out, and apocalyptic events are always associated with the turn of the millennium. The turn of the last millennium, everybody thought the world was going to end, so for us was only computers were going to win. So that would probably be the same thing, but it would be just as disastrous for us. So we've gone beyond all of that, and we're moving forward into the third millennium. I thought it was an opportunity to think. I mean, obviously that it's the third millennium of the time of Christ, of the birth of Christ, and so obviously it was a moment of unique significance for Christians. But since it's essentially the Christian calendar that we still use in most of the world, not everywhere, but most of it, most of the modern world, it was a unique opportunity to ask, well, what does this mean? It's a Christian event, but we live in essentially a non-Christian world, a secular world. And so how do you reflect on that? And I thought, well, this would be an opportunity to think through, well, what's the impact of Christianity, not just from the point of view of believers, but also from the point of view of the modern world generally and the secular world that we live within. So that's kind of the background to this little piece of writing that you have there. It's somewhat material that I use in my courses. Obviously, I've thought about these questions over the years. I teach at Catholic University, and we're always interested, as you are, in this question of how reason and faith, science, all hang together. The world that we're in is a world of specialists, so it's great to see you coming together in a group where, and essentially the specialist perspectives are, somewhat submerged, and you attempt to build something common, like the idea of the university, which is a vanishing idea, as you know. It's not. We have what's called a multiversity, not a university. So that's the reality of modern science and of modern disciplines of learning, that nobody can master them all. So we have to think a little bit about how we form something common. After all, the students are the ones who have to unite it all into one perspective, if they can. We don't help them very much in that regard. We throw it at them, and it's up to them to kind of do the work of integration. So this was all part of thinking through those issues. Since then, obviously, other things have happened, and I thought one of the things that I would start off with is just to read a little passage from Benedict XVI's Regensburg address, which really is addressing the question of reason and faith in the broader modern context. In fact, the two recent pontiffs, obviously, John Paul II wrote the famous encyclical on Fides et Ratio, which came out in 1999 at the turn of the millennium, and is in many ways he was probably that's why I dedicated the book to him, that he was the one who really thought that, in a sense, planned for the millennium in many respects, that he was always thinking that we're moving up to this point. And so this particular encyclical, it's the kind of culminating encyclical of his pontificate. And it is an extraordinary work that the Church, the Catholic Church in the contemporary world places itself on the side of reason. At a moment in historical time when you could say the faith in reason itself, the confidence of reason, the confidence of rational investigation, of rational thought, is under attack and under, you could say, a crisis of confidence. That it was extraordinary, I thought, for the Pope to issue a kind of word of encouragement to reasoners, to scientists, to the modern world that bases itself on the appeal of reason and thinks of reason as what it owns, what it possesses, what it bases everything on. The age of enlightenment, the age of reason, and all of that we're part of. So that encyclical was issued at a point where the crisis of confidence in reason was most in evidence, and so it was a wonderful word of encouragement to say that, look, reason is ultimately not only not in conflict with faith, but faith sustains reason, and faith is the background from which reason draws its sustenance, its resources, and all of that. And there's something very similar in Benedict, and in his account of it. It's a very different account. John Paul II had a much more philosophical approach to the issue, and the encyclical surveys many of the philosophical points of convergence. And Benedict has his own unique angle on this, which is largely informed by a kind of historical reading of the emergence of reason in the early church, not the medieval church, but the early church, and in fact before the time of Christianity. At any rate, I'm sure you recall this, but I'll just to remind you of the passage that he comments on and the Regensburg Address, by the way, is obviously to a group just like this, of professors and graduate students and others who in a sense come from different disciplines, and he mentions this, the problem of specialization and the difficulty that everybody has of talking to one another, and he has a kind of nostalgic moment about how they all met in the common room and were able to talk freely, and now that's no longer the case. But at any rate, he picked out this passage from the Byzantine Emperor Manuel II to his Persian interlocutor at the beginning of the end of the 14th century, 1394 to 1402, in which Manuel II says, God is not pleased to his Persian, to his Muslim partner in the dialogue. God, he says, is not pleased by blood, and not acting reasonably is contrary to God's nature. So he makes a huge case about God and reason being identical, that God is on the side of reason, and acting contrary to reason is never in accordance with not only God's will, but God's nature. Faith is born of the soul, not the body. Whoever would lead someone to faith needs the ability to speak well and to reason properly, without violence and threats. To convince a reasonable soul, one does not need a strong arm or weapons of any kind or any other means of threatening a person with death. And he, as you know, goes on in this vein in the address to really explore the dimensions of that. And the longer passage I'll just read through and comment for a minute is the one in which he makes the case that the convergence between reason and faith is not just doesn't simply originate with Christianity, but that it's already there in the Old Testament, and particularly in the time of the exile, when the Jews encounter the Hellenistic world and absorb a great deal of this. There are many things going on in the address, including a kind of critique of certain trends in theology called the de-Hellenization of dogma, the idea of getting rid of the Hellenic and the rationalist components from dogma and from theology, and he's obviously placing himself rather strongly on the side of the rational element, that it's somehow integral to the content of Revelation at this stage. He says, within the Old Testament, the process which started at the burning bush came to new maturity at the time of the exile, when the God of Israel, and Israel now deprived of its land and worship, was proclaimed as the God of heaven and earth, and described in a simple formula which echoes the words uttered at the burning bush, I am. This new understanding of God is accompanied by a kind of enlightenment which finds stark expression in the mockery of gods who are merely the work of human hands. Thus, he says, despite the bitter conflict with those Hellenistic rulers who sought to accommodate it forcibly to the customs and idolatrous the idolatrous cult of the Greeks, biblical faith in the Hellenistic period encountered the best of the Greek thought at a deep level, resulting in a mutual enrichment evident especially in the later wisdom literature. And he makes a big point about the wisdom literature. Today we know that the Greek translation of the Old Testament produced at Alexandria, the Septuagint, is more than a simple translation of the Hebrew text. It is an independent textual witness and a distinct and important step in the history of revelation. It's a pretty strong statement that the Greek translation of the Old Testament is a distinct and independent textual witness, and it is a distinct and important step in the history of revelation, one which brought about this encounter in a way that was decisive for the birth and spread of Christianity. And he carries on in this vein with a little sketch of the historical development from that. He says, a profound encounter of faith and reason is taking place here, an encounter between genuine enlightenment and religion, from the very heart of Christian faith, and at the same time the heart of Greek thought, now joined to faith. Manuel II was able to say, not to act, quote, with logos is contrary to God's nature. In all honesty, one must observe that in the late Middle Ages we find trends in theology which would sunder this synthesis between the Greek spirit and the Christian spirit. In contrast with the so-called intellectualism of Augustine and Thomas, there arose with Duns Scotus a voluntarism which in its later developments led to the claim that we can only know God's voluntas ordinata. But beyond this is the realm of God's freedom and virtue, of which he could have done the opposite of everything he has actually done. So this element of God as capable of going against reason is a sort of later introduction, whereas really at the very beginning and in the wisdom literature and the encounter with the Greek world, it is the affirmation that God is on the side of reason. He makes a good deal of this throughout the text there, and it's just, I think, of great interest that we have these two extraordinarily great popes placing themselves squarely on the side that faith is on the side of reason, that there's no kind of juxtaposition, no opposition between the two of them. Okay, let me just continue with the few reflections that I have to add to all of that, which is obviously very impressive as a point of departure, but what I have is obviously less impressive than that. I approach it in a slightly different vein, naturally. To some extent, I rely on the work of Eric Voegelin and his account of classical philosophy to really spell some of this out. And I find that particularly useful because when we think about reason and faith, the problem is that even the terminology is, you could say, encrusted with a lot of conventional attributes, and what reason means, what faith means, these are all, rather, historically laden terms, and terms that are that we have to dig deeper to get back to the fresh sources, to get back to the actual beginnings of things. And one of the ways of thinking about this is to ask ourselves, what does reason mean in the Greek discovery of reason? If we go back to the mystic philosophers like Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Xenophanes, we find that, in fact, they use two terms to describe reason. One term is logos, the one that indeed we generally translate as reason. But there's another term that is widespread there, which is nous, a term that we don't really have any longer in modern languages. Logos became ratio, and that became reason, but we no longer have the other term that the Greeks used, which is nous. The point, and by nous, Parmenides and the others, including obviously Plato and Aristotle, think about nous as the sort of meditative moment within the search for the ground of things by which the human mind encounters the divine reason that's the source of everything. The divine ground, the divine nous, as they refer to it. Logos is the sort of unfolding of that. It's the kind of logical development or elaboration of what's contained in it, but it's not the source. So logos is not the source of things, although St. John uses it in the opening of his gospel in that way. But in the Greek sense, logos is a kind of development out of this encounter with nous, which is the point of, you could say, a direct apprehension or a direct intuition of the ground of things, which is reason, and in which human nous, human reason, participates in the divine nous that's the beginning of things. So it's the opening towards being, as Parmenides also formulates it. The is, that's the kind of high point of our encounter with the order of things and the way in which everything is ordered from its source. There's that's one of the big obstacles for us to in a sense overcome. To realize that the concept of reason that we're operating with in the modern world is a concept that is somewhat impoverished. And there are many reasons for this, and I'll mention some of them, but including the way in which particularly the scholastics took it over and all of that. But it's a challenge to expand you could say the realm of reason into this much more metaphysical notion. That reason is not an instrument, not a faculty. It's a way of being in which we participate. A way of being that puts us in touch with the ground of things and with the source of things. And certainly that is there in taking a fresh look at the classical sources. Now, obviously the classical sources don't cover everything either. But one of the things that particularly Vogelin emphasizes in his account of it is that this encounter with nous, with the ground of things, is an encounter that is given. It's not something that we, you could say, control or command or manage to acquire on our own efforts, but that it is a genuine revelation, a theophanic experience, a revelation of the divine. So there is a kind of revelatory component to reason in the final sense. It's not simply reason on one hand and revelation on the other. Reason itself is at its highest point of the encounter with the ground of things, a revelation. Nous is a revelatory event within the Greek world. And so that's a perspective that we're unfamiliar with in the way in which we use the language of reason, based on not only the Enlightenment, but even the scholastic account of things, that reason is a faculty, an instrument that we use, is something that we control. Logic efficiency, means and ends, instrumental reason. All of these things are things that we're very, very comfortable with. But the encounter within which the ground of things reveals itself as reason is much more elusive and much more, you could say, difficult of access. But it's there, and it is that kind of moment of opening that constitutes the Greek world, which is itself a kind of miraculous event in history. There is something miraculous about the Greek world. It's not just one culture amongst others. It is that moment in which human beings encounter that which is and that which they understand themselves as participating in. So it is something very similar to the revelation of God in the Old Testament and in the New. It's not personal. It's not a personal God. The Nous doesn't address Parmenides in the same way that God addresses Moses and all of this, but there is something very similar about it. There's a way up to it, and there's a moment in which something happens that's beyond. So it is a kind of revelation of a transcendent reality. Now, in the subsequent development of this, we are inclined to think that, especially given our conventional view of things, that Christianity exists outside of that out of that rational speculation or that rational moment in terms of the Greek world, and we tend to underplay the extent to which Christianity not only cooperates with this Greek discovery of reason, and not only finds finds a modus vivendi in relation to the philosophic language and development, absorbs that into the language of theology and everything else, but that Christianity also represents an enlargement of the Greek account of reason. One of the sort of nice little summations of this is in Etienne Gilson's book, The Spirit of Medieval Philosophy, in which he makes the point that Christianity imparted a kind of broadening of the Greek account of reason and a differentiation within the Greek account of reason that has become a permanent feature of reason for us. So that anybody who uses the language of reason and uses the philosophic account is not only operating within a Greek framework, they're also operating within a Christian framework, Judaic and particularly Christian framework. And you cannot really, in a sense, be a philosopher without being a Christian, which is, not necessarily. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're baptized. It doesn't necessarily mean you go to church, but it does mean that you operate within certain categories that have become uniquely available through Christianity. Let's just think for a moment about what those are and how the Christian enlargement of reason takes effect. Primarily, the Christian enlargement of reason occurs because Christianity makes clear what this encounter with the transcendent entails. It's less obvious in the Greek case that the transcendent is a moment of grace, of revelation. Even where the revelation comes from is more mysterious. But in Christianity, that all becomes very clear, that the transcendent can only be known through its self-revelation. The nature of transcendent being is that it transcends us. It's beyond us. Even though Plato is the one who gives us the term transcendent, the epikeina of the beyond, of the vision of the good, you could say the logic of that is less apparent. Namely, that this is a moment in which the transcendent draws us into that other world, that by nature is beyond us, and that we can know only by the free gift of participation in the life of transcendent being, in the life of God. Ultimately, the logic of that is that there's nothing in this world that adequately reveals God to us, that adequately represents the manifestation or the revelation of God. So the only way in which God can reveal himself is through himself, which is through Christ. That it's only through Christ, through that which is God, that which is the fullness of divine being, that the transcendent can be known. So that's a kind of supreme clarification of this revelatory element within the Greek encounter with reason and nous and everything else. And this leads to a number of very significant consequences in contrast to the Greek account. One of the things that is very evident in the Greek account is that it launches us into sort of expectations that are never fulfilled. The search for perfection, for virtue, for the full self-realization, that in say Greek political philosophy in particular, this is very obvious that the polis exists for the sake of human self-fulfillment. Well, it turns out that very few individuals are actually fulfilled as a result of living in the polis, in the city. The life of virtue, the good life, is not attained by very many. And indeed, even the likelihood of the city being a virtuous city is very diminished. They were not completely unrealistic about it, but they nevertheless hold on to this, you could say, for us, highly improbable vision that this life can be a life in which our aspirations and our capacity, our potential is somehow realized. Whereas when you look around, you see that no, it's a life of great imperfection, great disappointment, great falling short, and you wonder why we don't despair. If you are looking at it simply in terms of how they describe it, that's one of the issues. So you could say there's a great kind of self-limitation of the range of reason in terms of how the Greek thinkers apply it. So the promise of fulfillment that they have falls dramatically short of what they seem to intend, they seem to aspire towards. The awareness of the imperfection of things seems to be covered over. The notion that the city could somehow become the best regime, the best city, the best constitution. These are all things that require a certain kind of leap of faith that we find implausible even on their own account of it. And then even things like the philosopher king. One of the reasons why we don't have philosopher kings is because we don't really think that that's a realistic expectation of human beings, that they are all going to disappoint us. This is why we have term limits, frequent elections, constitutions, the rule of law, and so on. These are all ways of checking the fallenness of human beings as we know it. And lastly, then the problem of evil, which in the Greek world is not well addressed, and yet it is a huge problem. So the question is then, how is it that the life of reason can be fully elaborated and fully recognized, fully applied, fully lived out without distortions, without distorting expectations and everything else, and yet admit, indeed, all of the ways in which it falls short. that's the challenge of the life of reason for us. It is that reason demands a level of realism, a level of self-criticism, a level of self-awareness that is not inherently built into it. And this is the unique Christian enlargement of it. Why? Because from the point of view of Christ, all of these things become irrelevant. Christ is the one who shows us what perfection, the perfection of human nature is, what the fulfillment of human nature is, what the victory over evil is, and what the final happiness of human beings is. So in a sense, all of the inbuilt, you could say, obstacles to the life of reason are surmounted with the advent of Christ in a way that from a purely rational philosophical level we would regard as extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. So in that sense, Christ makes possible the life of reason. Science, since we have many scientists here, I know, and we're very interested. We live in the world of science. We live in a world in which science is the major authority. In order to have the scientific investigation of nature, which again doesn't occur, it begins in the Greek world, but it could say its full potential, as we know, it is not realized there either. Partly because the Greek, for the philosophical world, nature is itself still full of gods, in the words of Heraclitus. They do not look on nature as a kind of, you could say, finite realm, a realm that's utterly separate from the manifestations of the divine and the sacred and so on, a realm for material investigation. The de-divinization of the cosmos is something that finally only occurs with the advent of Christ. The notion of nature that we have, which is that nature is a finite realm that can be investigated in its own terms without pointing towards anything beyond itself and without containing anything beyond itself. The realm of nature that's open to scientific investigation is really a realm that requires a kind of sharp distinction between the world of the gods and the world of you could say the world of the transcendent, the world of the divine, and the world of the immanent. The transcendent and the immanent. It requires a sharp distinction between the transcendent and the immanent, and that is a uniquely Christian achievement in the whole order of things. Now it's widespread within the world in which we live. But its genesis, its origin, and so on. And not only this is not only a question of historical details, it's also a question of the inner logic of these realizations. All right. The last area, just to comment briefly on this, and then throw it open for some discussion and conversation, is that Christianity, while it brings about this you could say, deepening of the Greek discovery of reason, an enlargement and an affirmation of what it contains and so on, it also creates unique problems of its own. Because now we have this sharp distinction between the immanent, this world, and what lies beyond it, the transcendent. So the question then is, how do you keep those two dimensions of experience in balance? And this is where, indeed, our discussion of faith and reason enters in as a topic that has been debated within the history of Christianity from the very beginning. The Church Fathers are there thinking about it. St. Augustine is thinking about it. the medieval schoolmen are thinking about it, and all the way up into the modern period, from the Reformation onwards, the question of the synthesis, the sort of integrating vision of things, now becomes a big question. And you could say that Christianity places this kind of contrast before us, with a kind of clarity and a set of demands that are novel but also intense. That we have to live in this world without being of it, and we have to find a way of giving each realm its due, its credit, its justice, being doing what is right in relation to each level of things. So one of the ways of thinking about this problem is to recognize, indeed, that Christianity opens for us this question of balance, of a proper way of navigating both our transcendent destiny and our responsibilities within this life, within this world, and our obligations to develop this world. So it puts all of that before us, and therefore, you could say, almost invites the problem of imbalance. And so the temptation to imbalancing emphasis becomes huge. So, for instance, it's not impossible it's not certainly implausible to think that the Christian demand for perfection, which is a demand that's opened by this vision of the transcendent, can be from time to time drawn back into this world. And so we seek a kind of short circuit, a kind of rapid transition into that moment of perfection. Impatience with the sort of long struggle, the long development of history, the apocalyptic vision of things, the Gnostic escape from this world into another world, and indeed politically, this is a reality in terms of our late modern world, of the great ideological movements, which are essentially movements of apocalyptic and Gnostic expectation applied towards the political, social and political realm, the realm of history. The notion of stopping history, the notion of history coming to its culmination, all of these things become, you could say, possible visions that now operate within our world. Yet, to the extent that we yield to them, they also undermine our notion of reason. And so reason itself is endangered. It's not just simply Christianity that's endangered by these developments, but reason also erodes and can be threatened and jeopardized by exactly these kind of aspirations to bring about perfection within time, to think indeed that what we do in time is somehow bringing about a kind of final age or a final fulfillment within this existence. These are all ways that in which reason itself is undermined, and we see this in, if you look at it politically, you see it in terms of, say, the impact of this line of thinking within the ideological movements, the notion that you can have a perfect economy or perfect politics or perfect human nature. These are all, these are still floating around, and so it remains a kind of responsibility, particularly of Christians, to find a way of bringing about that affirmation of the right balance between the two. Now, one of the points at which I disagree with Eric Voegelin, I'm not sure if you are familiar at all with Voegelin's work, but he places a huge emphasis on the kind of moment of jeopardy that's opened by the Christian, this Christian differentiation of the transcendent. And one of the things I find unsatisfactory is that he misses the point at which Christianity affirms the balance most profoundly. And that is in the person of Christ. That Christ is that point at which you could say giving oneself completely to life in this world is also, you could say, the opening towards its redemptive or transcendent meaning beyond it. So that the Christian life is not necessarily a life that's torn between two worlds, but it is a life in which makes possible what otherwise would be impossible, namely to give ourselves to a task that is doomed in this life. Because no matter how hard you work, and no matter how well you plan, and what great institutions you build, they will all disappear. You know, to be perfectly rational about it, that's the truth. But you can't do nothing, nor can you build a world of illusion and say, no, we're going to have nothing to do with this world, or we're going to absolve ourselves of responsibility, or anything else. No, you have to give yourself to this task of building things in this world and doing good in this world, knowing that its fruits will eventually disappear. Well, you could only do this if what you're doing is the same as what Christ did, which is that everything that is done in this world is, in a sense, a gift towards God beyond it, and is affirmed in that redemptive embrace of God beyond this world. That's the model of balance between the two worlds that now Christianity opens up to us and that we have to navigate. All right, maybe I'll stop there and let you have a chance to jump in. Oh, you've got a microphone here. Yeah.
Okay. We are still thinking about.
Still working up something to stump the chumps, as we say.
We are assimilating your
yes.
your conference.
I've really enjoyed very much your talks. So I was thinking several things, but for instance, when you have referred to this miraculous origin of philosophy, or this encounter with reason, I was thinking about the famous sentence by Clement of Alexandria, who considered that the philosophy was a sort of covenant with Greeks. Could you comment on that, or something? Because maybe not all the church fathers are so optimistic.
Right. No, that's a great question, and it was obviously something right there at the very beginning in the early centuries of the church fathers to work out, because they lived in a world in which, essentially the Greeks had educated. That was civilization. It was the Roman world, but the Romans learned from the Greeks. And so Greek philosophy, stood very tall as a kind of formidable intellectual achievement. So, what does this new spiritual movement of Christianity, how does it locate itself in relation to a kind of long-term civilization that's there? It's a big intellectual challenge for the church fathers, and they have to sort out, whether they're going to be a part of it, or whether they're going to assimilate this philosophic outlook, or are they going to hold it at distance and really kind of emphasize the contrast, because there is they have to navigate a difficult path here. On the one hand, they don't want to reduce Christianity to its Greek, to its philosophic message, and say, well, we're just like the Greek philosophers, and we're really another kind of school within that intellectual tradition of the ancient world. nor do they want to just, that's certainly what, there are many examples from the Church Fathers of kind of tendencies in that direction, as you know. And then there's obviously the opposite view, which is that, no, we have nothing to do with it. What has Athens got to do with Jerusalem, as Tertullian says? That there's a kind of sharp and dramatic contrast, and that's an abiding, you could say, theme within the history of Christianity too, all the way up to the present, including this stuff about the de-Hellenization of dogma that Benedict refers us to. But right in the middle is probably something like the Clement of Alexandria position, which is that Christianity enjoys two Old Testaments. We have the Old Testament of the Jews, but we also have the Old Testament of the philosophers, and that probably is the path that wins out in the long run. But it's also the one in which I think Christianity makes the greatest contribution and finds the greatest resources. And there is something like that in Benedict's account of it too. That revelation is not simply, and the work of the Holy Spirit is not simply something that happens in the Old Testament or the New Testament, that it also occurs outside of the Scriptures, as we would call them, that anybody who is open to reason is somehow moved by the Holy Spirit.
First in Spanish,
no? Sure. Yeah.
La cuestión es que cuando hablamos de cristianismo parece que nos estamos refiriendo a algo del pasado, una revelación que ocurrió. Es cierto que la revelación ocurrió en el Evangelio y está en el pasado, pero el cristianismo debe seguir mostrando la verdad hoy en día, y en ese sentido, ¿qué hacen los pensadores cristianos o cómo podemos entender esto hoy en día? ¿Cómo la revelación sigue en pie, ¿no? Hoy en día, ¿no? Y no solamente es un hecho del pasado, porque en el Evangelio pues no están las clasificaciones de los animales ni so I try to
okay.
This is in your talk I think that the term Christianity is something in the past, a little bit, no? The revelation in the past, and truth is like in the past. But if Christianity is now a way to revelate truth, it must be something in the present.
Sure.
Because we can't think now as in the time of the Greek fathers,
right.
or in the medieval times, because now we have another kind of arguments. And for example, Benedict tried to explain truth with the arguments of Habermas or with the arguments of everywhere, no? So this way for the truth now, the same truth, the same truth is the same truth. In the present, how can we show this truth to our contemporary world, not just as something in the past?
Right. No, that's a very good question, and thank you for it, because it kind of enables us to think a little bit beyond just simply what I've talked about. I don't mean, obviously, to direct us simply towards the past, but that's kind of a way to begin and a way to enter into the conversation. You're absolutely right that, and in fact, something that's a little unsatisfactory about Benedict's approach is that he thinks in historical terms. And so the examples that he gives us are historical examples. He had this conversation with Habermas, but it's just one little conversation. It's not. It doesn't change things all that definitively. But what I would say, just by way of response, is that this kind of enlargement of reason is not simply a matter of something that's in the past. It's also something that's happening in the modern world too. And most of my work is on the modern world, not on this larger historical perspective. And that's been of intense interest to me. That indeed the that the you could say the sort of impoverished view of reason that we conventionally operate with, that reason is entirely instrumental or it's formal, and that it has nothing to do with metaphysics, nothing to do with the transcendent. That's something of a caricature within the modern world. It's there, but it's not by any means the kind of sole view of things. And indeed, we very often have this sense that, the whole development of modern philosophy is it's limited in its account of reason, and moreover, it's hostile to Christianity and to the world of the spirit. I actually would challenge that view. I think if you, it's a common view, and certainly even Benedict operates with it to a certain extent, because everybody does operate with a kind of ready-made view of things. But when you read the great modern thinkers, you find indeed that they're more expansive than that. That they indicate really that you could say the truncated view of reason that they find as part of the world that they're in is no longer satisfactory even to them, and so they're very much more open to a kind of expansive, more Christian, more broadly spiritual account of things. And indeed, if you think about, say, the relation between reason and revelation, what are the great moments in which that is kind of synthesized? Certainly in the period of the Church Fathers, with St. Augustine probably being the kind of culminating moment of that. Although in an odd way he's a little bit off the beaten path, but he manages somehow to do it, to bring together and to really be the source of the Western tradition by acknowledging the philosophic, the Greek element, the rational element, and then the revelatory component. St. Thomas in the 13th century, who brings Aristotle and Christianity into a conversation. Where's the modern figure? It's Hegel. Hegel is very interested in the development of revelation and of religion and lectures on the philosophy of religion, as well as on the philosophy of history and on the history of philosophy. And indeed, we may have problems with the account. It may be somewhat unorthodox, heterodox, or whatever you want to call it. But you can't say that it's not a genuine effort to somehow address the question of how reason fits within this relationship to something beyond itself. Hegel is an odd figure to suggest in this way. We kind of think, well, he's kind of on the other side. Well, there are ways of reading Hegel that don't necessarily assimilate him to that negative judgment. And I mention this because I began reading Hegel with this sort of very negative view, and then kind of gradually found myself conceding that there is a way of seeing what even someone like Hegel does, or what the German idealists in general do. And there are more kind of orthodox examples within that group. Schelling would be a much safer bet than Hegel. But they're basically all addressing the same project. They have the same project. You can differ on the judgments of how well or how successfully they manage that project, but the project that they have is faith and reason, fundamentally. So here's the biggest development philosophically in the modern world.
Perhaps the last one, or not?
Well, I mean, when you follow that out, who are the from Hegel? Yeah.
Hegelin.
Right. Yes.
It could be another one, no? And this posterior to Hegel. Hegelin.
Yes. Yes, he certainly saw himself as doing something like that, but and he had a very kind of sharp rejection of most of the development from Hegel up to himself, which again I would disagree with, because I think if you look at the major thinkers, I mean after Hegel and Schelling, you have say Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Even Nietzsche,
yeah, but
perhaps.
For Nietzsche is the death of God. He's just telling us that at that moment there is no problem in the relationship between death and poison, because it's also done. The death of God is there.
The death of God, yes. Is
the last.
Yeah. I think it continues. Even Heidegger, I think you could read him in a different way. That's more sympathetic, and people do. And then after Heidegger, you've got people like Levinas and Derrida. You know, so it's much more. Yeah, there's a much more. You know, if you don't, I mean, one of our problems is, you know, we have certain prejudgments when we look at these figures, and we have a certain way of reading the development that we're part of. And so, you know, it's a little bit, it requires a little bit of adjustment to take on board a kind of slightly different perspective and a different way of approaching it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe the last question, because time is going.
Yeah.
Running.
I try to say in English, you have spoken about the encounter between Jews and reason.
Yeah.
And that's the translation, the Greek translation
Yeah.
of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
You have also spoken with this encounter between first Christians and especially the church fathers, also with reason. We have also the Illuminism with Kant and Hegel.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we need also a new concept of reason. You have spoken also very well about it, the enlarged concept of reason.
Yeah.
So I would ask you to speak as a prophet. How will be the reason in the third millennium, according to the title of your book?
Well, I'm not a prophet, but my professional obligation is to study these things as best I can. And you know, the last big project that I did was a reading of modern philosophy from Kant up to Derrida, basically the continental tradition. And I looked at 8 figures in that. It's a curious aspect that science forgets about the person that is the scientist. And so we have all of the we have some neurobiologists here, I know, and I know this is a hotly debated topic. How indeed can consciousness, the mind, and so on be you could say integrated with the neurobiology, neurophysiology, neuroscience that seems to make it all possible. That's one of those questions that you know, in a sense, seems to be settled by science itself, to be settled by the activity of science, not necessarily by the results of science, but to be settled by the very activity of science, so that to be a scientist is to operate in such a way that really your own kind of physiological functioning is irrelevant to the outcome. So even though everything in science says, no, everything you're doing here is a matter of brain waves and electrochemistry, what scientists themselves are doing says, no, 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 we're interested in truth, which is beyond anything we feel or anything that's happening inside of us, or you know. So you could say science, yeah, sure, it has a physiological basis, but it's certainly not reducible to it. And so you could say that personal dimension is, I think, the dimension to be recovered in all of these things. I just got a very interesting book by a neuroscientist, and I've forgotten his name, but the book is called Phi, the Greek letter Phi, and it's an amazing book where he tries to figure out how consciousness is made possible by physiological processes, and he draws in. He has a lot of scientific information in it, certainly, but he also includes a kind of artistic and you could say creative, imaginative account of it, where he has Galileo trying to figure out who he is and going through various dreams, and you know, it's an amazing kind of collection of things that you think, well, how is it? This is kind of a strange book, but if you're a scientist, you have to be prepared to broaden your own account of things, because that's the reality of who you are. You're not simply defined by the science you study. So.
Well, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. It's
Walsh,
a great pleasure.
Conference.
Great pleasure.
To the Center for Science, Reason and Faith.
Yes, thank you.
And we will see you again.
All right.
In the university.
All right, great. I appreciate it. Thank you.